What is going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I know this video is a day late. I know you know why. Marvel Snap was banned. We talked about that last video. I'm hopeful that it will come back up in the near future. I'm recording this on the day of the ban because it is the last time I think I will be able to get into my account to make this video. So let's get cracking, I guess. We are going to start with Move Bounce, a deck that is great at catching people by surprise. Much like, no, okay, I'm going to allow myself that joke, and then we're going to actually keep talking about this. Move Bounce is an excellent deck still. I feel like it is just generally pretty ridiculous. This metagame has sort of defined itself as one that cares about going really tall, and Move Bounce can go tall with the best of them. It does so with consistency. The fact that you have Frigga and multiple bouncers means that you're able to devote your enablers into your big guys, make a giant vulture, make a giant human torch, and then you can copy that thing as well. I think a lot of this metagame recently has actually kind of revolved around Frigga as a card that was previously like not necessarily underrated, but only viable in this deck. Finally, she has other good targets in other decks, and I think that's a notable thing to talk about. The real ethos of this deck is simply just going incredibly tall and not being able to be interacted with. The main things you're going to want to look out for are decks that are able to throw priority with you, playing things like Ghost and Invisible Woman, and using those tools in order to play cards like Shadow King and Shang-Chi sort of face down, so they're always going to catch something big. Killmonger is another card that you're going to have to really care about in that context. There is a reasonable target on this deck's back, and that is really the only thing that keeps it from being far and away the best thing to do in the game. It is a very strong deck that has some pretty specific things that you can do to try to beat it. It's hard to pick out a specific build of Moonstone, so we're going to talk about three. There's a bunch of different versions of this list, all sort of trying different stuff. I have been fairly partial to this package because it is less reliant on the curve out Wiccan stuff. Anyone who's watched my stream knows that I am extremely bad at having a 2-drop on 2 in every Wiccan deck I've ever played. So this deck allows you to have a much more forgiving curve with some real power to it. There are some issues, though. This deck doesn't go as vertical as you'd like. In a metagame that focuses heavily on verticality, it doesn't get tall enough to beat things like Move Bounce, and it can also run into situations where it doesn't get tall enough to beat things like Hela. This is a very good normal deck. And I think that's really what you want to think about this deck as. It's not necessarily built for this metagame, but it is sort of the standard. This deck will perform well. You will make a lot of 1/6s. I would almost make an analogy here to this deck playing fairly similarly to the old bounce decks. Not Move Bounce, but old bounce, where the consistency is very high, but the ceiling is relatively lower. For those who want to go incredibly vertical and 100% eschew the idea of even trying to beat the card Enchantress, you can play the Wiccan Onslaught build. This deck has the most points of any of the Moonstone decks, but it also has the most obvious weakness, which is you are stacking a very clearly Enchantressable lane, and you are counting on that card not existing. You really don't have outs to that. Like, your whole premise is make one big-ass lane, and that big-ass lane gets absolutely blasted by Enchantress. And there are a lot of people who are trying specifically to blast your big-ass lane. Finally, the small ball version, which I think of as the most flexible, but it runs into similar issues as the first of the Moonstone decks that we talked about, which is Move Bounce, Hela, stuff that goes really big, you're not necessarily going to be able to deal with. It's not exactly the worst thing in the world, but you are going to be more reliant on doing something genuinely unfair, like making a copy of a Victoria hand or of a card that's really strong that you get off of Iron Patriot and manage to discount. Again, not the end of the world when you run into those matchups, but they're going to have what I like to term the bully snap advantage over you. When they are snapping you, you have to respect it. And that is not necessarily a fun situation to navigate. So what does it look like to try to beat this? Well, there's a lot of stuff in this next section that I would term anti-meta, and I use that term loosely, but all of these decks are sort of bound by an ethos, which is you just don't want to give up on the move bounce matchup. And so a lot of them are going to be doing tricks with priority in order to make sure that they're able to leverage their Invisible Woman into Killmonger. Not this one, but another one will have that. But more importantly, Invisible Woman into things like Shadow King. Move bounce sees an Invisible Woman, and if they're smart, they can never put green power there because of the power of Shadow King. Ronan is here just as a big guy, but frankly, this kind of deck list should not be surprising to you in any meaningful way. It's basically exactly an Afflict Ajax deck list that is not investing in the Afflict stuff and is instead trying to be a Ronan deck because of all of the decks that are filling up their hand, making Ronan a much more valuable card at the end of games. You're still playing Malekith Anti-Venom. I did mess around with Shang-Chi in this deck over Malekith, and I came to the conclusion that Malekith was just a superior card. Shang-Chi's cool, but you can cover most things that Shang-Chi needs to cover right now with Enchantress and Shadow King. That's not everything, but stuff like Gore, Devil Dinosaur, giant cards off of Move Bounce, all of that stuff you can cover with those two cards. And so that is sort of the main descriptor of threats that I would say is in the metagame right now. There are going to be some times where you're like, damn, I wish I had a Shang-Chi. I did not find them common enough to put him back in. This deck is trying to be anti-meta in a completely different way. The idea here is basically if you run into someone who is playing Hela, you have Fenris Wolf, who is absolutely monstrous. You get to pin them between Fenris Wolf and your Alioth. That's a very, very powerful thing to do. I am really bad at drawing 2-drops, but even I feel like this deck is pretty good. Again, though, what's happening here is just full tech card. This would be best understood basically as a Sarah deck that thinks Sarah is not worth actually playing and would rather be playing other stronger cards like Wiccan. That's really what you need to understand this deck as being. It is just fully teched out. You can even get a Killmonger in here if you want to drop the Mobius. I've enjoyed having the Mobius, but I think they're, both good at certain things and both bad at certain things. I've also thought about going for Invisible Woman and Killmonger instead of Penny Parker and Mobius. I think that might be a real way to evolve this deck in the future, assuming Marvel Snap has a future. Anti-meta Sarah is really taking these ideas to its logical conclusion. What this deck is looking to do is have the ability to surprise every move bounce deck. If you want to beat the crap out of move bounce, this deck will do it. If you want to beat the crap out of Hela, you have draws that do that too. A lot of this stuff with Ghost is just going to get stuff done. Ghost is actually pretty interesting here because it is actually a surprisingly good follow-up to an Iron Patriot. Not bad to have a 3/5 as your follow-up to an Iron Patriot. It really isn't. Shang-Chi sort of comes with a lot of these Fenris Wolf Gladiator packages. I'm not necessarily convinced he makes the most sense in the list, but he definitely makes more sense here than he does in other versions of this, like ones that play Wiccan. I do think that if you really just want to beat up on people playing Move Bounce and the people playing Hela, this is probably a really strong way to do it. All right, so we've referenced Hela plenty at this point, and frankly, her decks are all weird and we're not sure how good they are yet, but people are definitely playing them. Let's take a look at 3 of them. This is the Paul Smackage one that I just did a video on. It is exceedingly hard to play for a Hela deck, which is nice because Hela was typically a fairly easy deck to play, but there's a lot of decision points here. Early returns on the stats have not been good, but it was very good when I played it. I think it is sort of an interesting, I guess you'd call it a beta test of what new Hela is supposed to look like, and I think using Hela as part of a package is a really interesting way to go about it. This is yet another Hela package, and you'll notice the overlap here is mostly that we're using very specifically Silver Samurai to target Gore, and then also, interestingly enough, to target our 5-power Ronin, which is the reason Ronin is in this deck. There's actually not a lot of really small stuff that you can hit otherwise. This is, again, a small package Hela deck. The idea here is Hela is going to bring back 1 or 2 things, one of which is a Gore, and then as a 6/9, you're just happy with doing that. It's also really hard to play. Like, this is a real pile. But I will say, as someone who lost to this and won with it, This was generally a pretty interesting and almost real feeling deck. And the reason I say almost is because I still feel like we're in the infancy of understanding what this new card is supposed to be. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're working on it, and gradually as we take these baby steps, Hela might become something to be truly feared again. The Danish Hela build is still being played by exactly one person in the top 20. Of course, that is Danish. This is a list that is sort of leaning into the RNG nature, where the other Hela decks are looking to be small package Hela decks. This deck is looking to be an extremely large package of Hela type cards. Having Ghost Rider involved gives you some redundancy. There's a lot of really crazy stuff that can happen with like a Ghost Rider on the board or a Gambit on the board and an Odin in your hand. A lot of really strong things can come out of this deck, but it does require kind of a lot of A, willingness to gamble, and B, willingness to set that stuff up. If you have a lane that allows you to do crazy stuff like that, sometimes you just have to take the chances that you can. And that is a hard skill to master. This is a tough, tough deck. RSM, I think at this point, will never not be playable. It is very far from the meta boogeyman that it was previously, but this is always going to be a deck that you're going to be fine with. Yes, you have some very awkward matchups into stuff like move bounce, but you're RSM. Maybe you'll just randomly generate the Invisible Woman and you're already running Killmonger and it's going to be fine. You'll get your Iron Patriot card and you'll ramp out an Alioth and they're going to lose. Who knows? There's a bunch of stuff that can happen. The RSM's wide range of outcomes is really the strength of the deck, and it's why people play it. It's also the weakness of the deck. Your bad draws are borderline unplayable, your matchups into move bounce are very unpleasant, and you need to have the right interaction for the right spots or you're going to get run over. I still think that interaction is Killmonger Lady Deathstrike, but it is sort of an open question at this point. Maybe we got to try to get Enchantress in here. Who knows? I'm not really entirely sure on the last two slots in here, but I am pretty sure about the rest of this. RSM is the same as it's always been. It is just good enough to keep doing what it's been doing the whole time. Discard is all right. I think it's a reasonable deck. I would say that I'm excited for Bullseye, but I don't know if the game will be up for me to get him. So with all of that said, Discard is a fairly strong deck with a lot of points. It can go vertical better than most people expect it to be able to, and because other decks are really taking a lot of the focus, you're gonna have a little less Red Guardian, a little more Enchantress, which can benefit you. You do run a Mobius, or Morbius I should say, that is a viable Enchantress target, so do be aware of that. There are some other issues that you run into, like Iron Patriot decks tend to have a similar output of points as you do, like the V-Hand Iron Patriot piles. They can really match you power for power, but by the same token, you can match them power for power. We talked about them way earlier in the video when we talked about Discard. I think that indicates exactly how underrated the deck is. It is very close to being truly elite, and I think a card like Bullseye could push it over the top. It is already the kind of deck that is competitive with some of the best stuff in the game. That remains true. Clog is Clog. I think at this point you know my tastes, you know that I don't enjoy the magic builds of Clog, and I'm very interested to play Annihilus Sentry stuff. I really do enjoy it. There are other ways to take this, like there are people who are doing, instead of necessarily doing Annihilus Sentry stuff, there's like more misery-focused builds of Clog, but I do think that this deck has some real genuine upside right now. We've talked a lot about verticality, we've talked about decks that really like to go tall. One of the best things to do against decks that really like to go tall is say, actually, you can't play cards. A lot of decks that are really built on going tall require the ability to play cards in order to do so. I know, it's crazy. This is a deck that exists mostly to counter what other people are doing, but it does have some baseline strength. The inclusion of the Sentry Annie package gives the deck more beef in worlds where it's not perfectly pulling off all of the Clog. It is still able to do a bunch of ridiculous stuff. It is also just kind of a 2-cube factory. Everyone knows to leave when they can't play cards. Mill has always been a little of an enigma, I would say. I think a lot of people have a tendency to underrate Mill because it is Mill and just be like, it's crap, I'm gonna stay against it all the time. But the thing about these versions of Mill is that if you look at them, they're not really running that many bad cards anymore. One of the big issues that Mill had was just card quality, but now it has Iron Patriot, which wants you to play Gladiator, which wants you to play Fenris Wolf. Almost every card in this deck, except for like pretty explicitly Yondu and maybe Death, has shown up in the best deck in the game at some point. Like, these are not bad cards anymore. And I think that that is something that probably has gone underrated as a change in this context. Mill is a deck that actually has some of the strongest Iron Patriots in the game. Like, straight up. You have Iron Patriots that pair with your 1/6 Demon. You have Iron Patriots with your Baron Zemo. You have Iron Patriots with your Gladiator. You have a bunch of really big guys. And that kind of stuff, it's like, it's very easy to get caught up in like, oh, they played a Yondu, their deck must suck. It's not necessarily true anymore. Like, most of these cards are just straight up good. I'm not saying this is going to stick around or anything, but I think people should recognize that Mill is in the process of not being a gimmick. There are less gimmicky things happening in this deck than there used to be, and Iron Patriot can do a lot of work there. One of the consequences of decks like Hela and Move Bounce coming out is that people really just want to do something that just totally makes them not be able to play the game anymore. If you just are a hater, if you're willing to lose when your deck doesn't work, but when it does work, you know you're going to get those 2 cubes and also get them really mad at you, this is the deck for you. This is, of course, the Doom 2099 deck with, of course, the Storm package, but I think it would be better to describe it as it's the Storm Legion War Machine deck. You're jumping through as many hoops as you can. You got Zabu, you got Psylocke. We're going to do the Storm Legion War Machine. If we can't do the Storm Legion War Machine, we're still ramping out of Doom 2099. If we don't do the Storm Legion War Machine, we probably get obliterated by anything that goes tall, but we have the sort of snap advantage because at any point we can just totally end the game. And I think that is a unique and fun way to play. I'm not necessarily sure that I would be super invested in it, but one thing you'll remember is I wasn't very high on this style of Doom 2099 deck a few weeks ago, and I'd like to explain why. In the intervening time, the metagame has become much taller. People care much more about total amount of stats. And because of that, this is a deck that, in my opinion, when you build around Doom 2099, you can't keep up, which means the deck now needs the gimmick. Where a month ago, it didn't need the gimmick at all. You didn't need to have, a Legion plan in your deck. You didn't need that in the slightest. But now you kind of do, because of how strong everything is right now. It's just a little bigger than Doom 2099 a lot of the time. I know a lot of these tier lists don't have Destroy on them, and I do think that it's worth talking about why. A lot of the time, Destroy isn't just bad, it's poorly positioned. It's trying to do something that the metagame isn't really about. Right now, though, Destroy is trying to do things that the metagame cares about. It's not as good at doing those things, or I should say it's not as consistent at doing those things. It does do them incredibly well, though, and I think that's a real point to be made. This is a deck that has the ability to go extremely tall. Extremely tall. And that is something people care about. Like, yes, Move Bounce is better at doing that thing, but you can play Destroy because it is doing what this metagame cares about. Last but absolutely not least is Mr. Negative. And you know how I've been talking this whole video about going tall and who gets the snap equity? This is a deck that goes taller than anything. That's the point of it. You're going to go absurdly tall. You're going to do 1 billion points. You're just not going to do it very regularly. That is a problem. Sometimes you run into real issues and you're not able to resolve them, like when you don't draw Mr. Negative or when you don't draw Jane Foster. And you have to be willing to just take those losses, retreat out for 1, and then go 4 or 8 cube someone when it does work. That's just how you gotta handle it. There's not a lot of people playing Mobius right now, and that means that Mr. Negative gets to exist relatively unmolested. It's not a permanent spot of good positioning for Mr. Negative. If it starts being picked up again, I think a lot more people will start trying to actually build to beat it. But this is a deck whose biggest predator is Mobius M. Mobius, and not a lot of people are playing it. This is a deck that is extremely able to go very tall, and that is what the meta cares about. And so Mr. Negative is as good right now as it has been in ages. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Question mark, question mark, question mark. No, all seriousness, a lot of people have been asking me for my take on this, and I assume that not everyone will have watched the video from yesterday, so basically I will say I kind of expect this to be resolved sooner rather than later. I don't expect this to be like a permanent state of affairs, but I don't really have a lot to go on there, just vibes. So it's possible that my vibe check here is totally wrong. We'll see. As always, though, please remember to like and subscribe. Frankly, it means more now than ever. And I hope I have a lot of viewers who are not in North America because yikes.